Good evening and welcome to the show. I'm Sharri Maxon. Tonight, negotiators are getting closer to an agreement with Hamas to release Israeli hostages. Labor's electric dreams running on empty as new car sales tank. And the director of the human rights group UN Watch reveals why Francesca Albanese's appointment to UN Special Rapporteur was an entirely political decision. Hillel Nua will join me live tonight. But first tonight, the knives are out for Anthony Albanese, with a senior Labor operative unleashing on the Prime Minister and his cabinet. The extraordinary assessment comes as United States officials released a statement expressing serious concern about the Chinese warship's attack on our Navy divers, the incident that Albanese didn't even bother to raise with Xi Jinping. It was a week ago today when a Chinese warship injured Australian divers using sonar weapons. The very next day, Anthony Albanese flew to San Francisco for APEC, where he met on the sidelines with none other than the Chinese President Xi Jinping. Look at this footage of Albanese approaching Xi from behind, knowing he was being filmed. And just 2 days earlier, Xi's Navy had deliberately threatened ours in what Deputy PM Richard Marles describes as a dangerous and unprofessional act, and one sailor was injured. And here was our Prime Minister just bounding up to the Chinese President, acting like they're old mates. As you can see, he went out of his way to go up to Xi to give the impression that they're friends who can now chat like buddies. And yet, it has now become crystal clear that Albanese did not mention the incident when he came face to face with Xi. Nothing. Opposition leader Peter Dutton today said the Prime Minister should apologise for not raising this attack with China directly.
The PM gets tricky with his words. I think the test here is whether he can just be upfront and honest and open. Did he say, these words to President Xi, or if not, if he didn't, then apologise. Just admit you've made a mistake, but be honest.
And you think Albanese should apologise at the very least to the Navy divers. The divers have the courage to fight for our country, but the Prime Minister doesn't even have the courage to raise this verbally with the Chinese President and Premier. In fact, the government completely withheld this critical national security detail from the public so that Albanese could avoid answering questions from journalists. He stood up on Saturday morning our time in San Francisco and held a press conference where he boasted about his meeting with President Xi, but he kept secret the attack on our Navy personnel.
Prime Minister, we saw a nice moment where you got up at the table there, went over to the President of China, shook his hand, spoke to him for a brief moment, 100 minutes. Obviously important for you to keep the goodwill going that you struck with him in China.
Yes, and indeed after the summit finished as well, I had a much longer conversation with the President and with Wang Yi as well. He regards my visit there as being very successful. We reiterated the stabilisation that is occurring, and of course our trade, the removal of any of the remaining trade impediments is very much in Australia's interest, but it was positive.
And then about an hour after his private plane had taken off, came the statement publicly about the incident. This is sneaky stage management. It's led to accusations from press gallery veterans of secrecy and a lack of transparency. And that press conference that you just saw, that was Saturday morning, our time. It's now Tuesday evening, and the Prime Minister has only done one media interview in all of that time. And in that interview, he said the attack was raised during the usual channels. Well, as Liberal Senator James Paterson said yesterday, there's no point in the Prime Minister being overseas so much, travelling so extensively, if he isn't going to stand up for our interests, our sovereignty and our values. And then this from Shadow Defence Minister Andrew Hastie and the Australian's foreign editor Greg Sheridan today.
He had an opportunity last week at APEC to raise this very significant incident with Xi Jinping, and it turns out, well, it appears that he did not. And so now we have the Chinese government deflecting and indeed, you could say, gaslighting us. Well, to use the Prime Minister's own formulation, cooperate where we can, disagree where we must. This was a moment to disagree and do so peer-to-peer, man-to-man with the leader of the Chinese government, Xi Jinping. We had divers under the hull of HMAS Toowoomba conducting risky work on the propellers, cutting away fishing nets, and they were subject to a sonar attack from a Chinese warship. It's unacceptable.
I mean, the Prime Minister's not talking to God here. He's talking to another head of government about an aggressive military action they've taken, which has injured one of our sailors. I also think the Albanese government is increasingly transparent in its dismal political management of these issues. This stabilised relationship has got nothing at all to do with Australian diplomacy, nothing at all. It's China deciding that it spent a few years punishing us and then it decided to take us out of the punishment zone. And it's then saying, and if you want to remain out of the punishment zone, you've got to behave like a proper poodle and not ever raise anything disagreeable with us.
Look, the Prime Minister is now under so much pressure over this that he's said to have cancelled his cybersecurity announcement that was planned for today, just so that he didn't have to face questions from the media.
I don't see why he can't go into any further detail about this, and I think it's a pretty fine distinction which is being drawn about the nature of the meeting, which seems pretty conveniently to line up with the Prime Minister's political interests, which is to refuse to have to answer questions about this.
The attack by the Chinese warship is so serious that the United States Foreign Relations Committee chair released this statement. It said China's latest provocation on the high seas, this time directed at Australia, is more than risky operational behaviour. It's an act of aggression undertaken in international waters. Lines must be drawn and enforced. Well, China has had no problems raising this publicly, incorrectly saying that Australia provoked this attack and was encroaching on China's national security. But it's clear that the Prime Minister right now is showing that he is being subservient to China. It is a sign of weakness. And more broadly speaking, there's more signals that the government's unity is unravelling further. Today, Labor campaign operative and former Chief of Staff for Bill Shorten, Cameron Milner, penned a damning report on the Prime Minister. The former Queensland Labor Secretary, who's worked on about 33 federal, state and local campaigns, wrote a piece saying that Albanese is travelling the globe as a latter-day Neil Armstrong and has not been in the country enough for a leader supposedly dealing with a cost of living crisis. He says that Albanese looks out of touch when Australians are hurting so much. If not for the parliamentary sitting dates, Albo would no doubt find anywhere else but Australia to fly in his plush Airbus he reportedly calls Toto 1, named after his COVID-era pet dog. Well, Albo sure doesn't want to know what life is like back here in Australia. When was the last time you saw the Prime Minister take a street walk and meet real Australians doing it tough? Well, Cameron Milner then takes aim at some of the Prime Minister's hapless ministers. He says of Tony Burke that he's been credentialing himself about the pro-Palestine ALP rank and file by not contesting the term genocide and failing to condemn an imam in his local area who was calling for jihad. Of the Treasurer Jim Chalmers, Milner says that his Weekend Glossy magazine profile looked like an application for the top job. Of Penny Wong, he rightly accuses her of saying that Hamas terrorists had been murdered. What nonsense. And Milner says there's speculation she may be looking to quit politics. On Richard Marles, Milner points out that if he were then to take Penny Wong's job as Foreign Affairs Minister, he'd have more time to play golf while using Avalon's international runway for his return trip to his long-suffering electors of Corio. And Cameron Milner, like the political editors for the major papers, he also thinks that there's a chance Albanese could lose the next election, just like he managed to lose support for the Voice referendum which initially had majority support. It's clear Albanese is running out of steam. He doesn't want to face the media. The scandals are growing. And now there's even talk that he might cancel the last sitting week of Parliament on December 7 because there's just not enough legislation for the government to do that week. David Crowe reports in the Sydney Morning Herald that the last day of Parliament could be November the 30th. He says that that would be a wonderful outcome for MPs who wouldn't prefer to go to Christmas drinks in the electorate rather than listening to the bells ring in Parliament. But it raises a question about Albanese and his cabinet. What does his government stand for? Is it losing energy? And on top of all of this, today the minutes from the RBA were released and they reveal that yet another rate rise is on the cards. And this would be the 14th. The new RBA Governor Michelle Bullock has also criticised the government's high immigration strategy in a speech, saying that there's not enough housing supply or infrastructure. She's also warned that wages growth at 4% is too high and could hamper the fight against inflation. And these are just two examples where government policy is working against the RBA's objective to deal with inflation. And as a result, inflation isn't coming down. It's not coming down fast enough. It's sticky, might even be entrenched now. And we're looking at more rate rises on the horizon. Just weeks out from Christmas, families and businesses are seriously struggling. And today, on the 18-month anniversary of Albanese's election victory, an election, by the way, where he campaigned primarily on what he called the cost of living crisis, well, we've had another 12 rate hikes since then. If it was a crisis back then, Prime Minister, what is it now? All right, let's bring in now Sky News host Caleb Bond. Caleb, thank you so much for joining me.
Pleasure as always.
Look, what did you make of Michelle Bullock's comments today in a speech where she clearly indicated that wage growth is too high at 4% at the moment and it isn't consistent, this is how she put it, isn't consistent with getting inflation back on track?
Well, that 4% is a 14-year high, and I suppose it's not unsurprising that at a time of inflation, people would, of course, be seeking pay rises to deal with that inflation because the dollar in their hand is being devalued, and so they need extra money to pay for everything that's going up. But the problem is when the federal government does not, through its own policy measures, do anything itself to reduce inflation, you've only got one measure left, and that's to increase interest rates. And, you know, I've been critical of the RBA, as have many other people. But if the federal government doesn't pull its own weight, and the comments made by Bullock today were very similar to Philip Lowe when he was finishing up as Reserve Bank Governor, when he told the Senate that the growth in housing, the number of new houses being built, is roughly half the increased rate of migrants. So it's not hard to see what happens in that circumstance. And if the federal government doesn't cut its own spending, then someone else has to. And unfortunately, that ends up being the consumer via interest rates.
Yeah. I mean, it looks at the moment like the RBA's just using interest rates as the only lever to get inflation under control. We need both monetary and fiscal policy working together. It doesn't appear that that's happening. And the other point to make about the high immigration levels is that at the moment, you know, while it's keeping us out of recession, technically speaking, it is putting more pressure on the rental crisis, on the housing crisis, as we've been talking about. And that's a problem as well when it comes to inflation. So deliberately, directly contributing to the issue of pushing rates up.
Well, it's like a dog chasing its own tail, because we always say, OK, we've got all these jobs we need to fill. So we bring in the migrants to fill the jobs. But bringing in the migrants necessitates more jobs because, of course, they need houses to live in, schools to send their kids to, supermarkets to go to. So you chase this sort of eternal growth that just goes on and on and on and on and on. You never actually plug the hole. And in the meantime, we find ourselves in a position where our quality of living is going down and our cost of living is going up.
and families are struggling even more, and our businesses too. Now, let's have a look at what's happened with this hijacking of the Israel cargo ship. Yemen's Houthi rebels have released footage of their military wing hijacking a cargo ship with Israel links in the Red Sea. They've taken 25 crew members hostage. Israel has said the ship is British-owned and Japanese-operated. They say that this hijack is an Iranian act of terror. I think we've got some footage to show you. I mean, Caleb, it looks like other terrorist groups are clearly taking advantage of the Hamas assault on Israel.
Of course, and I suppose you asked the question, why wouldn't they? Because they're all essentially in the same fight at the end of the day. They want the entirety of the Middle East, there's no doubt about that. But this is an extraordinary intervention because it has taken the war outside the bounds of Israel and Palestine and into international waters. And we haven't yet seen that. I mean, of course, we've seen protests and various other demonstrations around the world, but we haven't actually seen an act of war, an act of terror, taking, as we saw in that footage, the crew at gunpoint hostage and hoisting up Palestinian flags on that boat. They are showing they are serious. And this is not Hamas doing it, it's other groups as well. So if that continues, the escalation is extraordinary.
No, and we're already seeing it even on our streets, even if it's not terrorists. I mean, it's still anti-Semitism, it's global. Look, still on this topic, we're still hearing reports now from Palestinian journalists, also even from the White House. Joe Biden even indicated that he hoped a deal was about to happen
fingers crossed
between Israel and Hamas over the release of some of the Israeli Jewish hostages. I'm not sure from the reports that have emerged that it looks like such a good deal. You know, the reports that are coming out in the Palestinian media is that it would be 300 hostages released by Israel in return for 50 of the Israeli hostages released by Hamas. What do you think about this?
Well, I suppose what they're playing into is the fact that Israel has always put a high price on the heads of its people, right? And ultimately what they want to achieve is to get those hostages out of there. But you're talking about 50 of about 400 people who've been taken hostage by Hamas in exchange for 240. Potentially...
It was actually 239, but one person had a baby, so now there's 240 hostages.
But we're talking about this potentially involving such things as a ceasefire or humanitarian pause, as they like to call it. You're at war with people who don't play by the rules. And I have no doubt that if you had a ceasefire, Israel may well adhere to that, but do we really expect Hamas would do so? It's a question of what are you willing to give up in order to get those hostages back? I fear that going down this road may actually lead to a longer war and potentially the hostages who are not released staying there even longer, rather than a strategy to get them all in one go.
Look, it's a very difficult scenario. I mean, you know, you do anything to get your child back if you're a parent separated and they're being held by terrorists. But you know what? It's a very difficult dilemma for the Israeli government and society, and let's see where it lands. Meanwhile, our government here, the Australian government, seeking advice on how, again, to be tougher on these criminals that have been released in this detention scandal. What's the latest on what the government is now looking at?
Well, they're apparently seeking legal advice on whether or not they could pass laws to specifically detain people who have previously been jailed for crimes in Australia, which would be similar to terrorist laws, basically. I can't understand why they didn't have that ready to go when the decision of the High Court was dropped, because the decision of the High Court was that The government does not have the power to detain people under the Constitution. That's a decision that can be made by the courts, which very clearly opens the door to the government creating laws that allows the courts to detain those people, saying, OK, you're not a citizen, you were an asylum seeker, we've denied you asylum, but we either can't deport you or we don't want to deport you to a country where they're going to chop your head off.
Yeah.
So we're going to detain you. And that's a decision that the court can make. It would seem pretty up and down straightforward, but we know the government didn't have that ready to go. We got the legislation instead that they put up last week that was then heavily amended by the opposition. Now they say they're looking at it. Well, it's a little bit late. These people are already on the streets.
Look, just finally, another big story today that it looks like the government's green dream is really struggling. Chris Bowen had forecast that by 2030, which is not that far away, 89% of all cars sold would be electric. But now, according to this report in The Australian today, it looks like only a third of cars by that time frame will be electric. Where does this leave Labor's green target, Caleb?
Well, in tatters. And they've basically already admitted. I mean, Jim Chalmers admitted about a month ago that it would be impossible to meet the current net zero targets that they have set. Many people in the energy sector, Kerry Schott, who is a director of AGL, has been very open about the fact that we won't be able to meet our net zero targets, and this was a major tenet of it. And we're not talking about a small window they've missed here. Going from 89%, nearly 90%, down to a third is going to be a major hit to their targets. But the government's answer to that is we need to go harder, and that's what Jim Chalmers said a month ago when he was talking about net zero targets, that if we can't meet what we've got in front of us at the moment, we need to impose it harder, this idea that we enforce renewable energy, etc. So if they want to achieve the 89% target, they'll have no choice but to do the same with electric cars. And the way to do that, as the ACT already has said they will do, is to mandate that only electric cars can be sold from a certain date. I think the ACT is 2035, so don't be surprised if the federal government does the same.
They can't do that unless the cost of electric vehicles comes down. The average Australian can't afford them, and the infrastructure's not there in any case to charge the vehicle.
No, it's utterly ridiculous, but they could, by the stroke of a pen, do it if they wanted to. The ACT's done it. If they did it at a federal level, I mean, they can do whatever they want, but it would be disastrous. I mean, Australia's a very big country. Can you imagine trying to drive from here across the Hay Plain, go across to Perth in an electric vehicle, or working on a farm? I mean, we're going to have electric Land Cruisers or something.
Being able to charge it, I know. Caleb Bond, thank you so much. We'll see you later tonight on The Late Debate. Now, coming up, Peter Jennings will join me to discuss how Albanese failed to stand up for Australia's sovereignty and defend Navy divers during his face-to-face meeting with Xi Jinping. That's after this break. A Victorian education official apologised in person today to 5 Jewish students who experienced a campaign of anti-Semitic bullying at Melbourne's Brighton College.
I am deeply sorry for the anti-Semitic bullying endured by Jewish students during their time at Brighton Secondary. The bullying that Joel Kaplan, Matthew Kaplan, Liam Levy, Guy Cohen and Zach Snelling endured at Brighton Secondary is deeply distressing. I acknowledge that to them and to their families here today, and I apologise for that.
This apology only came after a very long court battle. Here to explain is Melbourne reporter Holly Edwards-Smith. Holly, welcome to the program. What happened to these students, and why did it take so long to get to this point today where finally there was an apology?
Well, Sharri, this apology is 3.5 years in the making, but as you say, this story extends much further than that timeline. Between 2015 and 2020, 5 students of Brighton Secondary College in Melbourne's southeastern suburbs say they were subjected to anti-Semitic bullying. This came in the form of jokes and taunts from other students, and they say that Nazi symbols and salutes were often directed at them around school grounds. That included the graffitiing of swastikas and the use of the Hail Hitler Nazi salute. So they took the school, the state, 2 teachers and the former principal, Richard Manock, to the federal court. And earlier this year, a federal court justice, Deborah Mortimer, ruled in their favour, saying that the former principal and the Victorian state had breached the Racial Discrimination Act when they failed to properly and adequately address the bullying that these 5 students endured. All 5 of them left the school prematurely, 4 of them saying that that was a direct result of the bullying that they experienced. And today, Dr. David Howes, the Deputy Secretary of Schools and Regional Services here in Victoria, on behalf of the Department of Education, did offer them a public apology. They also did receive a letter of apology written or signed by the Premier and Deputy Premier of Victoria late last month. This apology was refused by one of those students, Matt Kaplan, who also says that he refuses the apology that was given today.
All right, Holly Edwards-Smith, thank you so much for your coverage of this today. And it's just appalling. I mean, this is a public school. This is long before the current war. Students for years had to fight in court because the Victorian Education Department, the teachers, the school principal, everyone refused to accept that they were subject to anti-Semitism, refused to apologise for it, refused to address it and fix it in the classroom. In fact, the Victorian Education Department and the government funded a battle against them in court. It's extraordinary. This apology today should have happened long ago. Now, let's return to our top story. Anthony Albanese refusing to stand up to China, being all buddy and friendly with Chinese President Xi Jinping. Peter Jennings is Strategic Analysis Australia Director, and he joins me now. Peter, thank you so much for your time this evening. Look, this is an important story. The Albanese government says it's had a reset on the relationship with China. It's been boasting about that reset, proud of it, saying that they're normalising relations. But is this what normalising relations means? That when you have a hostile act from a Chinese warship that injures one of our sailors, that you don't raise it when you see the Chinese president, and in fact you just act all chummy and pretend nothing has ever happened?
It's remarkable, Sharri, and so much for, you know, the Albanese mantra that we would push back when we needed to. If attacking Australian sailors is not sufficient cause for the Prime Minister to complain to Xi Jinping, then I can't imagine what would be. And here we get to the reality of this so-called stabilised relationship. It is that our government is going to tie itself into absolute contortions, refusing to acknowledge what average Australians know to be true, which is that China is a bully, particularly under Xi Jinping, and they will continue to bully Australia and lots of other countries in the region. So I think the Prime Minister's performance was woeful. He didn't have an agenda going into APEC, but he got one handed to him with this opportunity. And not simply talking to Xi Jinping, he should have gone to the Canadian Prime Minister, Mr Trudeau, who's complained of similar behaviour against a Canadian warship. He should have gone to the US President, the British Prime Minister, a number of others there to essentially démarche, to create a sort of a broader protest on the part of countries that happen to be members of the G20 that are suffering similar hostility from the People's Liberation Army. And the fact that Albanese failed to do that just tells me that, you know, he's become very sort of lead-footed in the way that he's trying to run foreign policy. And I think it's going to be something that Australians will be really disappointed by. You know,
and concerned.
It's the PM's job to stand up for our Defence Force when they come under attack.
Yeah. I mean, look, I think initially people thought, oh, it's good that, you know, China's lifted some, not all of its trade sanctions. There's still trade sanctions in place on some beef products, on lobster, on wine. We still have an Australian, Yang Hyung-jin, still in prison, wrongfully detained. But, you know, one coalition source, Peter, said to me today that Albanese is becoming a useful idiot for China. And it does look, you know, it's such a serious incident that the US, the chair of the Foreign Relations Committee, put out a statement today expressing how serious this is, this targeting of an Australian diver in international waters with sonar weapons. You know, if America can stand up to it, do you think Albanese is being too subservient here?
Absolutely he is. And it's a puzzle to me why such a priority is being put on insisting that we take Australia back into an abusive relationship with the People's Republic. The government is now at complete odds on what its messages should be to the business community. The message should be find other markets, find other sources of supply, don't become dependent on China. In fact, I think this is, politically really silly for Albanese too, because if average Australians can see that this is a problem and the Prime Minister's not even prepared to talk about it, they're just going to get cynical about him. They're not going to say that our bilateral relationship with China is in a brilliant state. It's not, because with the exception of those trade issues, China is not altering its more aggressive behaviour in the region. And that means it's inevitable we will continue to face incidents like this and worse, and other countries will too. And Australia needs to be prepared to, push back really hard and publicly against those things.
Yeah. I mean, if there's one thing we need from our Prime Minister, it's to stand up for our sovereignty. That is the most important thing. Now, Peter, just on another topic, there are reports, and we stress that they haven't been verified by Israel, but there are reports coming out of the United States. Even Joe Biden has said, kind of fingers crossed, that a deal might be close between Israel and Hamas, brokered by the US and Qatar, for hostages to be released. Peter, I'm interested in your thoughts on this deal. You couldn't say outright, oh, it's an amazing deal, the details that have been released. Obviously, it will be incredible to have 50 Israeli hostages brought back home, especially the children and the babies. It's heartbreaking that they're currently in the arms of terrorists. But why is it 50 Israeli hostages released in return for 300 Palestinian? How can that be the deal?
Well, there's some precedent for it, Sharri. I recall an incident about, I think, 5 years ago when one captured Israeli soldier was released by Hamas in return for, I think, something like 1,200 Hamas terrorists that had been held in Israeli prisons. Israel puts an enormously high price on its citizens, and I'm, very sympathetic to them doing that. But if the reports are true, that of course still leaves 200 or so individuals being held hostage. And it doesn't end the war. It seems to me that Israel cannot give up on its core strategic objective here, which is to destroy Hamas's military capabilities and to take the Hamas political leadership out of contention. Now, I can't imagine that that's what Netanyahu is about to do. But I guess if they have an opportunity to get 50 people released alive, then that is something that Israelis will want their government to do. So it's a horrible dilemma, as you've been saying.
Yeah.
But I think they need to take that opportunity if it's available to them.
Yeah, and we'll see how this unfolds. It's said to be in its final stages, so it's just a waiting game now. Peter Jennings, thank you so much, as always, for your insights and your courage to say it like it is. Thank you. Now, still to come, Deputy Prime Minister Richard Marles again in hot water over his expensive VIP flights. Paul Murray and Liz Storer will join me to discuss next. Welcome back. Here are the top 5 stories you need to know tonight. The RBA is prepared to hike rates again in the coming months as the governor warns current wage growth of 4% is on the high side for curbing inflation. Police found the wreckage of a plane that crashed into Port Phillip Bay on Sunday after colliding with another plane. More than 100,000 DNA samples collected by Queensland's forensic lab may need to be retested as the findings of the second inquiry into the bungled lab testing were handed down. A White House official insists negotiations for Hamas to release Israeli hostages are getting close to the end as Houthi rebels seize an Israeli ship in the Red Sea. And the chairman of News Corp, Lachlan Murdoch, has been welcomed by Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky into Kiev, along with Benjamin Hall, who was injured covering the war for Fox News. Well, in just 2 days' time, there's plans for school students in Melbourne to walk out of class in protest against Israel. There's been a petition sent to the Victorian government imploring the Premier to step in and stop the pro-Palestinian protest. Jacinta Allen should be making it very clear that no student is allowed to skip class. These protests are anti-Semitic. At times, they're aggressive and violent. And the main problem is that it risks bringing anti-Semitism into the classroom, into the schoolyard. This morning, the Premier finally insisted that children should stay at school.
I want to be absolutely clear. Thursday is a school day. It is the government's expectation that students be at school. Additional advice and support is going through the Education Department to schools to ensure that students are at school on Thursday.
Such an obvious statement. It took her so long to get to that point. In New South Wales, police were forced to use special powers to break up yet another pro-Palestinian protest, but this time it was outside the office of New South Wales Premier Chris Minns. There were over 100 people who were protesting, showing the Premier covered in blood in their signs. They were saying, "Stop war crimes." As you know, Chris Minns is the only Labor leader around Australia who has shown clear leadership in calling out anti-Semitism. He's introduced laws where they're necessary. He even toughened them up today to make it easier to charge people with racial vilification. He's been standing clearly with the Jewish community. He's been incredible. Joining me now, Paul Murray and Liz Storer.
Hello, mate.
Welcome to you both. Paul, look, it's one thing for children to leave school to go to climate change rallies, but rallies where they're going to bring anti-Semitism back in the classroom, because we know what is said at these protests. It's from the river to the sea. It's calling for the annihilation of Israel. This is unacceptable.
I'm completely with you. The only problem is that it's already there because they're willing to go to the protest in the first place. Whether they feel greater solidarity because they see greater numbers than just 5, 10, 20, they see hundreds or thousands, means that it becomes deeper ingrained. One of my major issues with this particular protest is that there's a protest every Saturday. If they want to be associated with the issue, you can go every Saturday. The idea of trying to do it as some sort of standalone to try to make it a rolling series of protests, firstly, it dilutes the message. Secondly, they don't care what the Premier thinks. They don't care what we think. They don't care what the parents think. They don't care what the reality of the situation is. This is cause du jour. This is cause du jour because TikTok's told them that there's only one side of what's happening here. Everything just magically, nothing happened on October the 7th. It all happened on October the 8th. So it's a completely distorted worldview that they have. It's an unnuanced one, but it tells you everything about the modern virtue signalling and the modern showing off of your worldview, that rather than doing something that might inconvenience you, which is not playing sport but going to the rally on a Saturday, instead the thing that doesn't inconvenience you, which is to say, look at me while having the day off on a Thursday.
Blow off something I don't enjoy anyway.
Liz,
Correct.
Can I say, as a Jewish mother of children, all of us Jewish parents are doing everything we can to protect our children from the anti-Semitism that's exploding all around us on the streets.
Absolutely.
The idea that fellow students in Melbourne are going to go to a protest like this, be further, what's the word? Be further radicalised against Israel, be chanting these things, bring it back to the classroom. You know, a lot of Jewish students are at public schools.
Absolutely.
This is terrifying.
Absolutely, and it's well within the Premier's remit to simply forbid it, to simply say, OK, if those students leave, they get expelled, or something that hard-handed. That is the kind of response that we need to see, because it's also going to cause division if simply you don't go to the rally, but I did. So what does that say about you? There's going to be an automatic split created in these schools, and what kind of precedent does it set? I don't care if it's a climate change rally or any other kind of rally. These are children. You're not voting age yet. This is not for you to take to the streets during school hours. Period. Of course, this is far more serious because we are talking about, I'm sick of the word anti-Semitic, anti-Semitic. Let's just call it Jew-hating, because that is what it is.
Exactly.
And for many teachers, many people, we talk about the long march on the left through our institutions.
That's what's scary. The teachers would agree with this, probably.
Exactly. And for them, this is the fruits of their labour on display. They are quietly, low-key proud of it. These are kids which are the product of this meta-Marxism, whereby every single relationship, every single conflict is seen through the lens of power, and there's an oppressor and there's the oppressed, and if you side with the oppressed, or who you think is the oppressed, then your virtue signalling is, you are morally superior, you are doing the right thing, and you can do no wrong in the pursuit of defending the oppressed.
Well,
that's
also,
what we're seeing here.
Also think about something that's even a little more meta that's at play here. There's one political party that believes that the age to which you qualify to vote should be dropped to 16, and that's the Greens.
Yes.
I guarantee you tomorrow that in amongst the Palestinian flags, in amongst some of the distasteful signs, are going to be signs for a political party that this is all about trying to get them to sign up to their worldview, or to say, we're down with it with your worldview, and in our world, we'd give you the vote at 16. Now, one of the reasons why we keep it at 18 is because obviously a whole series of responsibilities kick in when you're 18, but there are forces amongst us, including, remember, there's the potential here that if this government goes into a minority and it becomes the price of admission for Green support, that things like lowering the voting age to 16, which of course will vastly change the outcomes of elections, this is all part of their long march through the Australian democracy,
100%.
and they're using kids to do it, and the kids are more than happy to go with it because these are the adults that are reinforcing their stupid worldviews.
Liz, on another topic, Greg Sheridan wrote quite an interesting, provocative piece in the Australian newspaper today. He's basically saying that we need to have more babies. Australians should be having more babies and fewer immigrants, is what his argument is. He says that every individual has the right to make their own decision about having children. No one should be criticised, but these choices are made in the face of coercive feminist and green ideology that depicts children as enemies of self-fulfilment and destroyers of the planet.
Wow.
In an atmosphere where the entire Western project is demonised. What do you think about this, Liz?
He's absolutely hitting the nail on the head here. This is how the West ceases to be the West. Just 50 years ago, let's take London, for example, far older than us, but it used to be 86% white British. Now it is just 36% in just 50 years, just 5 decades. Like, that is hair-raising, and we are seeing it happen across the West, not just because of this mass migration that we're seeing, some of it legal, some of it not so much. But we are seeing what I call invasion by design, whether it's across the southern border in America or across the Channel into the UK, costing taxpayers a heck of a lot of money. But here in Australia, we import from overseas because our fertility rate is so low, and obviously we need more people. Howard and Costello, they should have kept that baby bonus. Whoever ditched that has got serious things to answer for. Countries like Hungary, they take this extremely seriously because they want to stay hungry. And so every child you have, up to 4 kids, a woman gets 25% less tax. And so if you have 4 kids or more,
want to get
you
to
never
another story
have to
with
tax
you, Paul.
another thing in your entire life.
Let me save you from the censors. Obviously, keeping Australia is not keeping Australia white.
No.
Obviously, anyone, as long as they share our values, whatever the reaction is.
I don't believe I said that. I said, if you're here, we want you to have more babies, as opposed to importing them. That's what Greg's saying.
I'm saying for those that will half-hear, run off to the principal and misinterpret what you were saying, particularly about Europe, but what you're saying, I'm completely with, right? Which is we want more little Australians. We want them to be able to have, most people to be able to not just have 2, but have 3, because then you're not just replacing, you're adding.
Paul, I want to just quickly get to you before we run out of time to another topic. Our new sole chairman of News Corp, Lachlan Murdoch, one of the first things he's done is to travel to Kiev. He's met with Vladimir Zelensky, as you can see. There was also Fox News correspondent Benjamin Hall. We've had him on this program. Amazing guy, beautiful family. He nearly died in Ukraine covering the war. This is an incredible show of support from the very top of our company, and it comes after Lachlan Murdoch at the AGM last week also expressed support for Israel, and he spoke out against the despicable rise in anti-Semitism.
Absolutely. Also, the visibility of reminding people about this conflict that's taking place as we speak. For obvious reasons, you see this all the time, where it'll go wall-to-wall coverage for the first 2 weeks of anything, and then slowly but surely it starts to move away. For obvious reasons, over the past few weeks, the attention of conflict is about the Middle East, while this conflict is absolutely still active. Fox News going all in with a special tomorrow, I think that'll be airing here in Australia, with Brett Baer interviewing the President. Good stuff.
All right, Paul Murray, Liz Story, thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Liz Story, sorry,
Cheers,
see you at 9 o'clock,
Sharri.
10 o'clock tonight. Still to come, human rights activist Hillel Newer exposes the United Nations. Stay tuned for this report after the break. Welcome back. Well, the Executive Director of United Nations Watch, a human rights campaigner, Hillel Newer, joins me now. Welcome back to the program. So wonderful to see you again. Look, I want to ask you about this United Nations Special Rapporteur, Francesca Albanese. She was just in Australia doing a big publicity tour where she seemed to mostly speak out against Israel. Hillel, what are her conflicts of interests in this role?
Look, Francesca Albanese is someone who pretends to be neutral. Neither her position nor her own background have anything to do with impartiality. Her position is called Special Rapporteur on Palestinian Human Rights. In fact, her mandate from 1993 is to investigate only, quote, Israel's violations. So her mandate is only to investigate Israel. And the reason they picked her is because she is extremely biased. This is someone who in 2014 wrote on Facebook that, quote, America is subjugated by the Jewish lobby. This is someone who a year ago, in November 2022, spoke to a Hamas conference of terrorists, and she said, quote, you have a right to resist. This is someone who has regularly compared the situation of Palestinians to the Nazi Holocaust. So she is the last thing that has anything to do with impartiality, neutrality, objectivity, and she should be exposed.
What do you think about the role that the United Nations has played in this war? I mean, the United Nations that, you know, once gave Israel its very existence, how has it been in this war?
Well, the UN should be neutral. It should also have moral judgment. And what we're seeing is an abandonment both of neutrality and of moral judgment. The United Nations should be condemning Hamas for their atrocities, the massacre of October 7th. Instead, what we're seeing is, I would say, the vast majority of UN statements are pointing the finger at Israel. They're failing to make the distinctions that international law makes. There is a fundamental difference, I would say the difference of civilization, between terrorists like Hamas, who seek to massacre civilians, and a democracy, Israel, which is defending itself from the terrorist group and is seeking to do everything to avoid targeting civilians, to hit the terrorist infrastructure. Sadly, Hamas cynically uses human shields. Hamas puts their civilians at risk by embedding their terrorist infrastructure, and we've seen it in the videos that have come out in the past few days, beneath Shifa Hospital, beneath mosques, beneath schools. The videos are there. We're seeing the tunnel shafts, we're seeing the weapons, we're seeing the rocket factories. And you know what, Sharri? Everyone knew it.
No, absolutely. We've known for years that they've used civilians as human shields. You know, it's Hamas that are putting Palestinian lives most at risk, not Israel. Look, just very quickly, what do you think of the fact that almost from day one after the terror attacks, there were calls, including from figures in the UN, for restraint and a ceasefire?
Look, there was a ceasefire for about 2 years until Hamas broke the ceasefire, invaded Israel, and massacred men, women, children, and babies in the most brutal way. So when a country then seeks to defend itself to stop Hamas from doing what they say, their leaders have said they're going to do it again and again and again. They've been very clear. Their intentions are genocidal. And the United Nations is failing to recognize that. Instead, they're pointing the finger at Israel. They're pretending that Israel is targeting civilians. It's a lie.
Yeah. Hillel Newer, your work in exposing all of this is incredible. I'm so grateful that you've joined me on air tonight. Thank you very much. I'll see you at 5 o'clock tomorrow. Thank you so much for watching, and here's Peter Cradlin.